Welcome to Beyond the Box, where we sit down and have in-depth discussions with some of the brightest minds in academia. Join us on this intellectual journey as we go beyond the box and expand our knowledge of the world around us. I am your host, Ali Tazhibi. Welcome to Beyond the Box. I am your host, Ali Tazhibi. Today's episode is going to be a fascinating one as we have a special guest with us, Dr. Stephen Joyner. Dr. Joyner is a full-time instructor of chemistry at Moorpark College in California, where he has taught a wide range of chemistry courses to undergraduate students. He received his PhD in chemistry from UCLA in 2007 under the supervision of Nobel Prize winner Sir Fraser Stoddart. His research was focused on the template-directed organic synthesis of molecules containing mechanical bonds. Today, we'll be discussing various topics related to chemistry, organic chemistry, chemistry education, and hopefully much more. And I hope you learned something from this. Dr. Joyner, welcome.
Hi, good to be here.
So sort of a classic question. I'm hoping to ask this, and converse about it with other guests too, but I would like to start with sort of what sparked your interest about chemistry. How did you go down? How did you find this path and decided, oh, this is what I want to do. I want to do chemistry, and tell us about your story.
Sure. So I think that I was always interested in sciences in general. Growing up, I would enjoy my science classes, enjoy my math classes, all those sorts of things. And so just kind of focused on those subjects. And when I was in high school, I did not particularly like my chemistry teacher. And so as I was heading to college, people would ask me, what are you going to major in? And I would say, well, something in the sciences, but definitely not chemistry. And so I think that, it was taking those basic science classes, getting ready for a career in science, knowing that I was interested in and passionate about science. I found myself enjoying the chemistry classes in spite of the fact that I thought that I wasn't going to like them. And so when it came time to declare my major, I kept telling myself, well, I'm definitely not going to be a chemistry major, but then that just ended up being what was speaking to me, and kind of looking at the classes and things like that I might want to take in the future. That kind of ended up being the direction that I went. And so, certainly I can point to a few professors that probably helped to have an influence on that, and why I was enjoying those classes. There were definitely other science classes that I was enjoying, and part of it was looking ahead and kind of thinking, what would I be learning about? What would I be studying? Chemistry just seemed to resonate more with me than any of the other subjects that I was taking.
Right. So that's pretty interesting, and I was wondering, did you ever hate organic or any sort of chemistry course yourself? Because I know for a lot of undergraduates, such as myself, there has been a period, or it will be a period of time, where you're taking these courses, you're finding them very challenging, and you're just like, oh man, I hate what I'm studying right now. And was there ever a moment like that for you? Did it ever sort of influence what you were deciding to do with your career and the path that you had chosen?
Right. So I think that, UCLA is on the quarter system. So organic chemistry is 3 quarters instead of 2 semesters.
Yeah.
And that second...
Although I believe it might be a little different now. There's a 30 series and there's a 14 series.
So that was still there when I was there. So,
okay.
As a chemistry
so
major, I
took the curriculum that much.
I took the 30 series as a chemistry major. Actually, it was called 130 back then, so you got upper division credit for it. But it's exactly the same courses. They just renumbered them in the 30s instead of the 130s. But I took, the second quarter of organic chemistry, which is now 30B. I took that. That was the class that kind of made me second guess things. It just felt like a lot of memorization. And I wasn't, I felt like I wasn't enjoying it as much as I had enjoyed the first quarter. And so I was really kind of questioning whether that was something that I wanted, to continue to study. And I don't think it made me question chemistry completely, because I had really enjoyed all of my classes up to that point. And I knew that organic was just one of multiple sub-disciplines of chemistry. So what it definitely made me do was it made me think, well, maybe organic chemistry is not going to be what I choose to pursue within chemistry. I know that I have to get through this, and I'm going to have to learn some other chemistry classes.
Right.
And then, so that particular class was maybe a low point for me in terms of my overall career, and it really turned around after that, because for the third quarter, I actually had Fraser Stoddart, who was my advisor, was also teaching that class, and so he wasn't my advisor at the time. He ended up being my research advisor, but
Right.
he was teaching that third class, and was just a really good teacher and really passionate about the subject, and so that really kind of turned me around in terms of the material. And then I took several of the upper division organic chemistry classes, and all of those professors were really good and really. And so in retrospect, I look back at that one and say that was an anomaly, and that was at least partially me just learning how to study organic chemistry and kind of going through some of those struggles that a lot of students go through, and struggling with can I do this, and how do I learn this, and like the pitfalls and failures that a lot of students go through when they're learning how to study organic chemistry.
Right. It sounds to me like that you did a lot of troubleshooting, like a lot of us students, in those difficult classes, to sort of figure out what works best with studying a certain topic, right?
Yeah, and I think I didn't reach the point where I knew how to study organic chemistry probably until that third quarter. And so in that second quarter, I was surviving.
So you were a chemistry major at UCLA.
I was a chemistry major, yes.
But you weren't sure. You haven't declared yet at that point.
So by the time I was taking organic chemistry, I had declared.
You had declared.
I did not take organic chemistry until my third year at UCLA.
Right.
Because I did not think I was going to be a chemistry major, so
see.
I didn't think I was going to need any of those classes. And so I was focusing on sciences in general. I probably thought I was going to head down. I was pretty sure I was going to head down the physical science path. So I had made sure to take my physics classes very early. I had started my chemistry classes a little bit later.
Right.
And I had taken all of my math classes because I knew that math was going to be important for anything. So I was really focused on kind of those aspects.
Right. Speaking of how important math is, I mean, as you know, I'm an immigrant coming from Iran, and my parents have always been worried about how much math me and my brother know. They've always emphasized, like, whatever you end up doing, you need to know enough math. And that's certainly proved to be the case, like you said. What I do want to ask you, sort of going off of that troubleshooting process, and I'm going to give you a little bit of background in case, I'm pretty sure you already know about this whole thing, but there is a fairly new and recent field of study sort of related to education and chemistry. So, and I believe it's called chemistry education research, and it's exactly what it sounds like. They basically, there is the people who have degrees in chemistry and education go out to classrooms, and they have sufficient knowledge of both, and they're trying to figure out, what works best for student learning, especially in those difficult classes. And there is a lot of different research going on in that whole field. I was reading a couple papers on that, and I came across how, they're using eye trackers to see what students are looking at when they're being taught organic chemistry, for example, and how that, and try to conclude with qualitative data with numbers that the student is thinking about hydrogen atoms, and now with water molecules, and it would just appear on the screen, and they would track the eyes and everything. So a lot of research along the same lines. And I was wondering, sort of, from your years of teaching, what do you think are some of the challenging parts of teaching organic chemistry? What's been at the core of your concerns when you're teaching an organic chemistry class, or any difficult chemistry class?
Sure. So, first of all, I wouldn't characterize chemical education as necessarily being a new field of research. I think that there's definitely a lot of new studies that are constantly coming out. But the Journal of Chemical Education was many years old, even when I was a student.
Oh, I see.
And so I've definitely read articles, and I'm aware of a lot of the types of things that people are covering. What I would say is that a lot more campuses are becoming open to chemical education research. And so the
Oh,
difference would be that when I was a student, there were maybe 2 or 3 campuses where if you were interested in teaching chemistry for a career, and you weren't planning on going into research, but you just wanted to teach chemistry, whether that was at the high school level or at the community college level or some other level.
right.
There were really only a few campuses that were focused on the teaching of chemistry,
Chemistry.
as a career and an educational pathway. And what I think has happened is that a lot of other campuses have now recognized that the lecturers that they hire, like somewhere like UCLA, there's a number of lecturers that are not research faculty that teach often those lower level classes, kind of recognizing that those lecturers actually have a major intellectual contribution to make to the field of chemistry, and that
Right.
they're the ones that are on the front lines teaching students how to think about chemistry and kind of teaching them those early things. And so I think there's a lot more interest in what they're learning and how to share that knowledge to a broader user base so that more people can learn the lessons that other people have learned. And so a lot of the principles that I teach students are things that I first heard from other faculty, whether that was through the grapevine or directly. Some of the faculty were ones that I taught for when I was a TA at UCLA. Some of the faculty were ones that I have taught with in my professional career, and kind of talking to them and saying like, what works for you, and I have this problem, and all of those sorts of things. I think that what makes organic chemistry in particular really difficult for students is that it's not very similar to general chemistry. And so for general chemistry, you're learning all of these principles, and there's a few things that certainly we use in organic chemistry, but it really takes a strong left turn, if you will, and goes way off the path that general chemistry was leading you down. And that's, for many students, that's the first time that's ever happened in their life. So if you think about like how elementary education is structured, for example, in a math class, for example, let's say in second grade, you're going to start off by reviewing what you learned in first grade, and then you're going to expand on what you learned in first grade, and then you're going to kind of maybe add on a few skills, but it's all still going to be based on what you learned before. And so there's always something that you have to fall back on, where you're like, okay, even though I'm not comfortable with this new thing that's being taught to me, I have skills that I am comfortable with that I can rely on, and I can add these skills to my skill base and hopefully eventually put them into practice and become more comfortable with them. And with organic chemistry, we're really taking such a hard left turn off of where students are comfortable and going into this
Right.
whole new way of thinking about chemistry and looking at chemistry and studying chemistry. And a lot of the methods that we use have been developed by chemical educators. So if you look at kind of the way that textbooks have evolved, the original textbooks on organic chemistry were very memorization heavy, where it was like, here's a
Right.
bunch of things, memorize this, memorize this, memorize this. And through lots of processes, modern textbooks have kind of become much more on the
Practice side.
well, I would say the logic side. And so
Right.
showing, instead of so for those people that aren't familiar with organic chemistry, we have these things called functional groups in organic
Right.
chemistry.
Yeah, I was going to mention
And
that
so
actually.
so original textbooks were often organized around the functional group. And so they would
Right.
say like, here's
At
a
the beginning, you
chapter.
would have a chart of all the functional groups. Go and memorize that. Come
Right.
back.
Well, but then
Build up on that.
Right, but then you would have a chapter on alcohols, and so your chapter on alcohols would be, here's all the ways to make an alcohol, here's all the ways that you can use an alcohol.
Right.
And many of the ways to make an alcohol would involve functional groups you hadn't studied yet, and so you'd be seeing these
see.
reactions that were out of context that you didn't understand, and you would just be expected to memorize them. And then you would move on to your reaction or your reactions of, let's say, a ketone.
Right.
And as you were learning your reactions of ketones, you would say, here's all the ways to make a ketone, here's all the ways that a ketone can react.
Right.
And you would see some of those alcohol reactions again, because an alcohol can be used to make a ketone, and a ketone can be used to make an alcohol. But by focusing on the functional group, what you're missing out on then is the why. So why do ketones react the way that they do? And why do alcohols react the way that they do? And just focusing on how to make an alcohol from a ketone, you don't
Right.
necessarily see that this is a pattern of reactivity for ketones. And so a lot of modern textbooks have now completely shifted the focus and talked about the why first. And that's what's really such, I think, a big left turn for most students, is that we're trying to get you to understand the why of reactivity, and there's no basis for that. And so we have to build up all of the concepts of how
Right.
to look at a molecule and think about a molecule and how to understand why a molecule is going to react. And then the punchline is almost like, oh, by the way, now that you know how it reacts, here's how you can use that to make an alcohol.
To make an alcohol.
Yeah, and so right, and so it's like, it's a different perspective, but
Right.
it's focusing first on the why,
Mm-hmm.
and so all the teaching tools that are associated with that, and the fact that we now use mechanisms for that, and so to see kind of how do electrons flow and how do the electrons behave during these reactions, and how does that cause them to react in the way that we know that they react. And so a lot of that has come from chemical education, but I think that what makes teaching organic chemistry so hard, going back to what I see as the struggles of teaching the subject, I think that what makes that so hard is that students don't have these basis sets to fall back on. And so a lot of my job in the first semester of organic chemistry, particularly the first half of the first semester of organic chemistry, is convincing students to use certain tools to study. And I know why that's going to be important because I know what they're building up to. But students are very resistant to that because they've never used these tools in any, class in the past. And so they're like,
Right.
I know how to study science. I've passed a lot of science classes. Here's what works for me. And for me to convince them to abandon what works for them and
Right.
to switch to something else that I know is going to work better for them in the long run, it's this struggle. And students can often do well on the first couple tests using their old tools because we're still reviewing
Right.
things that worked before. But at some point, those old tools, and I think that's really why I struggled kind of at that halfway point.
Yeah,
is that
same here.
had
I
to-
think
right.
I also have a personal anecdote. Sort of my personal anecdote about that, what you said, convincing students that they need to abandon. I like I told you before we started recording, I was a very cocky student coming out of, not cocky, maybe like very overly confident, I would say. Thinking that, oh, I have everything under my belt. I've passed Gen Chem, I've passed calculus, and calculus is also challenging in its own
Sure.
form and everything, and I've passed biology, and this is not going to be harder than any of those. So the sort of the hard left turn that you were talking about, I didn't realize it up until I really messed up on the second and the third exams, and this was during COVID, so there was already a learning curve trying to adapt to everything that was going on, and it was really difficult for me to just understand the whys. Like I would see you had a lot of emphasis on learning the structures and understanding how they define reactivity, for example. And personally, it was really difficult for me to understand how is reactivity and structure related? Like how are these two? One of them is just how a molecule looks like, and like trying to imagine that, like going from, for example, where does a molecule fit? Like what could be a binding site? What defines reactivity in a certain setting? And there's certain things along the same lines were what I personally struggled with. And yeah, and I think it relates to what you said earlier about abandoning the whole belief that, oh, this is how I do science and organic chemistry is a science, and continuing.
Yeah, and I think that that's not uncommon, and I think that another thing that makes organic chemistry honestly very hard to teach is that the students that are taking an organic chemistry class were usually the stars of all of their classes before. And so they're in a very similar situation that you're describing, where they've done well in all their science classes. You don't take organic chemistry until at least your second year of college
Right.
chemistry. And so you've done well and passed, I mean, at least 2 college chemistry classes, but usually a lot of those classes you're describing, where you've passed a number of other sciences. You've taken physics, you've taken biology, you've taken all these college level classes. You're doing well. You're often the person in the class that other people are going to for help.
Right.
And it's also around the time that we see that a lot of students that are not in closely related majors are now starting to abandon the chemistry department because it's like, okay, I've gotten what I need out of this department. And now I'm going to go be a structural engineer or something. And so they don't need any more chemistry than like a year worth of chemistry. And so it's getting to this group of students that up until this point have been the elite students in their class, where they were the ones that were doing really well. They're interested in the subject.
And it's very demoralizing coming back
and
from
so
that.
exactly. And so that's the second really hard part of this, is that
Right.
it's this group of students that are used to succeeding, and getting them okay with the fact that part of learning is failure. I mean, we have to fall down in order to get back up and learn something, and so a lot of also what I find myself doing over and over and over again is coaching students through that kind of mental struggle where they're like, they're feeling down on themselves, and they're feeling like they're, like, oh, maybe this isn't for me after all, and getting them to, to see that struggle is a normal part, of learning, and that you have to be okay with not always getting a perfect score on things, and that's going to be okay. And it's getting them to learn to use the tools, to learn to think like an organic chemist, but also to be okay with the fact that there's a learning curve, and that they're not always going to be at the forefront of that learning curve, and that does not make them a bad person. It does not make them a bad student. Right. And, I have these little speeches, if you will, that I've got kind of like stored away, where I'm like, I can kind of sense what's, going, oftentimes a student will come in and they'll be like, oh, I'm struggling with this particular thing. And I'm like, this is the 55th time that I've given this speech. But for that student, it needs to be the first time. I need to sit there and connect with them and say, like, what you're going through is real. This is a real struggle for you. This is okay that you're struggling with this. And if they get the sense that this is the 55th time that I've given this speech, then they're going to be like, oh, he's just blowing me off. Like, it's another, and so I have to be able to, exactly. So a lot of what I do in organic chemistry is kind of using those tools to get students to where they need to be. And, I often, my wife is also an organic chemistry professor, and so we at home talk about some of these things, and we joke that that organic chemistry students have Stockholm syndrome by the time they're done. Like, they start off absolutely hating us. We're like their captor, right?
That is very true. I remember when I was getting into biochemistry, I expected it to include a lot of organic chemistry, but for some reason it didn't, and I was fairly disappointed. And I was disappointed at the fact that I was disappointed. I was like, I'm past a difficult course. Why do I expect more difficulty from, something else that involves organic chemistry? But you're right. No, the Stockholm syndrome is actually real.
It's this thing where it's like, I'm your captor, and I'm the one that's holding you back from your grade. I'm preventing you from advancing in your degree and your education pathway, but I'm also the only person that can help you get out of that. And so at some point, and so like it's hilarious to me because, you took organic chemistry with me during COVID.
Yes.
But, many times, both before and after that, in the first few weeks of the semester, I'll have old students stopping by that are like, hey, how's it going? Like, and just seeing like my current students like shoot daggers at them with their eyes. Like, they're like, how can you like him? He's a jerk. What's going on? And, and it's, I think it's that, but it's, you have to kind of get through that, and then you can start to appreciate. And at some point you realize that I am on your side, and that I'm here to help you learn, and that it's us versus the material together. It's not me versus you for a grade, but it's a difficult transition for a lot of students because it's so many new things coming at them.
But as a student, I feel like a lot of students like myself, we feel if a professor is really passionate and wants to teach you something, we feel that sort of passion from the other side as well. I don't know if you realize that we know it, but for example, in your class, you offer a lot of support in a variety of different ways. I don't know if you're still doing this in your classes, but because like you said, I took your class during COVID, but there was this one discussion section that we had on sort of the platform we used for the course website, Canvas, where you would encourage students to ask questions, and you would give a timeline. Oh, I'm going to try to answer these questions. Other students can answer your questions. And I remember it was always the busiest the night before exams. And you'd always also be online the night before exams. And I remember if I immediately needed an answer to something, you'd just be on there typing. And I would get this very thorough, very complete explanation. So things like that, those kinds of attempts and approaches, make us students also realize, oh, this person is here to help me. They're on my side. They're not this basically harsh grader who's the cause of my downfall, sort of. And I
Right.
think
No,
that's also a part of the process of getting over and accepting failure as a as a part of learning, because you want to realize that you have to realize that these professors are also there to help you. And to be frank, from a student standpoint, some professors do not really feel like they are, trying to help you. They're just there to get the job done, give the 56th lecture that they have for the past 55 times, and just get passing, go about their own lives. And the TAs grade the papers and everything. So in your class, at least, and many other professors who I'm really thankful for personally, that has not been the case. So I really wonder, what do you think is the motivator behind it? What do you think makes an educator sort of, be passionate about the work that they're doing and offer those sort of various approaches?
So for me, and I mean, I'm sure it's different for others, but for me, I think it's two big things. I think the first one is that you have to be doing it for students. So it has to be a student first thing. People that are in it for the money or for prestige or for, any other reason, that's going to show. Right. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I would not do this job if I wasn't paid. Like, obviously, I need the money, but yeah. That is, I mean, I chose this as a career because I want to help other students learn chemistry. I like chemistry. I want to pass along my knowledge and my joy for the subject. I want other students to learn. It makes me really happy when I see other students go into the field and choose to be chemists and all of those things. So there's a lot of things that I really like about it, and I really like passing along that knowledge. So I think first is you have to want to teach. But I think the second thing for me that I've learned throughout my career is that I always need a project. And so I am constantly looking at what I'm doing and asking, what can I change? What can I do better? What can I do to make this better for the students? Right. And, I was told when I was first hired that it takes you 3 times to get through a course before you're comfortable. And so the first time you're teaching it, you're just panicking and trying to get all the material together. And you're like, oh my gosh, I have to give a lecture tomorrow on something that I've never lectured on in my life. The second time you're going back through and kind of fixing all your mistakes. But it's that third time where you're finally like, okay, I actually know what I'm doing and I have a plan and I'm ready to teach this. And once I got to that third point, I was like, well, I'm home free now for my career. Like, this is it. I'm done. And that was around the time I started having kids. And so I got into kind of this like, for a period of maybe 2 or 3 years where I was just like, hey, my course is ready. I'm done. I've done those 3 times. I know what I'm teaching now. And things started to get really stale for me. I don't know if it came across to the students, but things definitely started to get really stale for me, where it was like, okay, I'm teaching this for the 4th time, for the 5th time, for the 6th time. I'm just doing things the same way. And there was a faculty member here at Moorpark College who kind of, one day, he was our department chair at the time, and he started off, we have a yearly meeting kind of right before classes start where we sit down as a department, and he just said like, hey, here's what I'm working on this year. Let's go around the room and everybody say what new thing they're going to try this year. Right. And I was like blown away because I was like, new thing to try? Like, I haven't tried anything new in a long time. What am I going to try? And so, I gave some lip service to it, and at the time I thought like, well, okay, whatever, but then I really kind of took that to heart, and I started to think, well maybe that's something that I should be thinking about, is what can I continuously improve. And I think that ever since then I have an active project every year. So there's something every year, and sometimes it's something super minor, sometimes it's something that's pretty big, but there's always something that I'm doing where it's like, this is my goal for the year. This year, I want to try this. Right. And some of my projects haven't worked. Some things I've said like, whoa, it was better the other way. And I've gone back and kind of erased that. Some things I've adapted and changed. Some things I've kept. But I think that helps me to feel connected to the students, because I then am always looking for that, like, what is it that students need from me? And I've been doing this long enough now. This is my 16th year at Moorpark College. I've been doing this long enough now to also see changes in students. And so I can legitimately say that there are things that I did in my first 2 or 3 years that I don't think would work with a quote unquote modern student. And I think that there's things that I'm currently doing with modern students that I do not think would have worked 16 years ago, because the ways that students have been educated before my class have changed. The comfort with students with certain technologies have changed.
Right.
And so being able to do things or not do certain things.
Like the iPads. Now they can just do the hexagons on the iPads and not even have to draw every
absolutely
little side of it.
And so technology is a big part of it, and certainly utilizing technologies is important. But also just things like I think that students, when I was first hired, were more used to non-interactive lectures. And so that was just a way that they had more of those, and
Sort of dry lectures that
and so I think that if I were to jump in and try to play a game with those students, there would be almost a resistance to that, where they would be like, okay, why are this is wasting our time. He could be spending this time teaching me something, and instead he's spending this time kind of reviewing things in a game format. And so that might be an example of something that may not have worked as well 16 years ago, because there would have been a resistance from the students, where the students would have not wanted to get engaged in that. Whereas I think now, sitting there and just putting up a bunch of lecture slides and talking through that, I think that that's death in the classroom, because students are not educated that way at all in K through 12. Right. And you're going to put them to sleep if you just sit there and show them a bunch of lecture slides, and you don't add to that in some way if there's nothing else that's part of your lecture. So that was never the way I lectured. I never had just lecture slides, but I think that again, it's the transition in the way that we teach, as well as the technology and things like that.
That's very true. And you also, the way that you make the course material engaging is also very cool too. I mean, I remember Organic Chemistry 1, when you were still creating those COVID pre-recorded videos, and forgive me if I'm butchering the organic chemistry portion of it. There, I think, I don't remember exactly, but you were teaching us about orbitals or something like that in that video. And I remember so randomly, and this came out of nowhere, and like we were talking about, I don't know if it was before we started recording or after, sort of like that was the thing that made me snap out of my own like little distraction during COVID times and focus on the lecture. You started laying out shot glasses in front of you, and then you pulled out a flask out of nowhere and you started pouring in. It came out different colors.
Right.
Yeah.
And so that is a demonstration that I actually got from JChem Ed. So we were talking about the Journal of Chemical Education, and so that particular demonstration kind of helps students to understand how orbital theory works and how orbital combination works and things like that. And so that was a demonstration that was developed by someone else. I unfortunately I don't remember who, because it's one of those things, I read the article once and go, oh, that would be fun. And so I ran out and got some shot glasses and a flask. And that is something that I was doing live before. And so you're right that I did record that, because it's something that I still do in my classes. Where I pull those out during that lecture to talk about that, and it's something
that was really fun. And also your expressions and everything, it's conveying that, hey, the person teaching you is also a human,
right? And
they also, at some point, they had to learn what they're teaching you right now, and what they're doing is for the good of you,
right?
So as a student, seeing that sort of thing at the first time, that your first initial basically response is, oh, this is funny, and then you get engaged, and then you learn throughout the process. But then you think about it again, and you're like, oh, like this is more than just a way to teach. This is to also tell the students that I'm like you. Like, I also like putting shot glasses in front of myself and everything, and like with your whole expression and everything. And also, this was again during COVID, when everything had been shut down for a long time. So seeing that sort of being in that sort of environment that's fun for learning was very refreshing, I think.
And I think that I lucked out in terms of COVID, in the sense that that was my 13th year or so teaching.
Yeah.
And so having been able to having taught the class so many times with students, and knowing what the students' feedback would be if I was in person, knowing where they're going to laugh, knowing where they're going to be paying attention. When I was recording videos for COVID, I gave all of my lectures as pre-recorded videos for people that are listening and obviously weren't in my class. I had all these pre-recorded videos, and when I was recording those, I was standing in a room in my house staring at my iPhone on a tripod that was like across the room from me, but I still tried to pretend like that was that classroom of students. And so, I tried to imagine what the students would be looking at or what the reaction would be, how they would be. And I having 13 years of experience, that was easier for me to do than I think it would have been if I had been starting off teaching in that environment where I wouldn't necessarily know how to engage with the viewer, because if there's not someone there when you're lecturing by yourself in a room in your house to a camera, it's not real. It's not a real lecture. And so
for sure. And I personally, as your student and as someone who's taken classes with pre-recorded material, I really could tell the difference because I remember your videos, some of them used to be really long too. Like when we had a 1 hour video, that was amazing. That meant that for this week, you're going to have a light one. But the videos were going to be long. They're going to be 4, sometimes 5 hours even.
Sure.
But like I said, we could tell that this is going to be fun. Like I didn't mind sitting down for, let's say, 2 sessions of 2.5 hours and watching that 5-hour video because I knew it was going to be fun. It was going to be engaging. I was going to get something out of it. But I've also had professors and classes that had pre-recorded material where the video was only 20 minutes, but I absolutely did not want to start even watching it because I knew it was going to be boring. I knew it was not going to be engaging. And I think that's sort of where the difference will show. Like if someone's actually trying to teach you, if someone's actually trying to be by your side, like you said, you can tell as a student.
Right. And so I think that in terms of those pre-recorded videos, one of the attitudes that I had to take was, in March of 2020, when we suddenly locked down and none of us were prepared for that, I finished out that semester with whatever technology I had around the house, just getting lectures done, and they were not very engaging, but my students knew who I was. And so I think that they were willing to overlook that and forgive that because they already knew me. And so they could imagine me giving that lecture, and it was just, I'm giving the lecture I would have given, but I'm giving it in my bedroom,
this was like a month and a half into the
exactly
pandemic.
Right.
I mean, not into the pandemic, into the year.
So again, going to this idea of having a project where I need, in order for me to feel like I'm doing something, I need a project. After May was over and looking and saying like, okay, this is going to go on for a while. Like this is something that's not going to be done by the fall. I'm still going to be in my house giving these lectures next fall. One of the things that I realized was that new students coming in would have no awareness of who I was, and that if I was lecturing in a way that they couldn't see me and feel like they connected with me, that they weren't going to be able to learn from me, because I think that connection is very important when you're learning from someone. And so over that summer, I built a green screen studio, for lack of a better phrase. And yes, it was just a spare room in my house, and you couldn't find green screens online. They were completely sold out. And so I found
everyone else was trying to navigate through
but I found
recorded videos.
What was it? I can't think of the word, a catering company that was selling off their linens, and they had green tablecloths. And I was like, I'll buy a green tablecloth. Great. Wow. And so I hung a green tablecloth from my wall because nobody was looking for green tablecloths. Everybody was looking for green screens. Wow. So, just kind of like coming up with these ideas where it was like, okay, I need to, but my goal was to make it an in-class experience, even though you weren't in class. And so I was on the screen. You could see me pointing to things on the screen behind me, even though in reality I was clearly not in a classroom pointing to things on a screen behind me. And so I needed to have that. And then I treated all of my lectures for that entire year. You talk about the length of lecture. Well, I lectured for the number of minutes that I usually lecture for. Right. So if something would be 3 lecture classes, then 3 times an hour and a half, it was a 4.5 hour lecture. And so I lectured the same way I always did. I was just lecturing to camera in a room, but I was trying my best to pretend like I was standing in front of a classroom of students and trying to make that connection and trying to like look at that camera in the eyes, and even though so.
But there was also the lab portion of your classes that you had to navigate through. I mean,
that was very difficult. Moving a lab online that was never designed to be taught online, and that was really a collaborative effort among hundreds of organic chemistry faculty across the nation.
Was Beyond the Labs a part of that?
So Beyond Labs was
Beyond
Labs was a company that had developed a product that was really intended to be used as a pre-lab assignment. And so the idea was so the idea behind Beyond Labs is that you could try multiple things and the lab would explode if you messed up. And so the idea
I remember the little flask exploding. So there would be glass shatters everywhere.
Yeah. And so the idea was, let's let you figure out why the procedure is the procedure that we're going to follow. And so the idea behind Beyond Labs was you would assign a lab first electronically, and students would figure out how it needed to work, so that then when they got to the classroom and it said, distill this, they would know why they were distilling it, why they weren't doing something else, because when I do something else it explodes, when I distill it it doesn't explode. And so they could figure out what the purpose was. And of course in a real lab we can't do that. We can't say like, oh, see what happens, and then the lab blows up, because we can't do that. So Beyond Labs was definitely not assigned to be a lab substitute. And so it was a lot of faculty kind of nationwide, and yes, Beyond Labs hired a bunch of people, but the people that ran Beyond Labs were also organic chemistry professors, so they were equally as stressed out and panicking over the exact same things that all of us were. But I think it was kind of a lot of people nationwide looking at what tools existed and really spending that summer of 2020. I went to, I don't know how many online meetings talking to other organic chemistry professors, just what ideas do you have? And everybody just saying, how are we going to navigate this?
That was just a summer before you started teaching organic chemistry here.
Summer before
during COVID.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. Yes. So summer of 2020. So kind of coming out of that spring.
That was actually my class then.
Exactly. And so just everybody's sitting down and saying like, what is an organic chemistry lab going to look like online?
Oh wow.
And there were professors in other places that had very different lockdown rules. We're in California and our rules were very strict.
Very strict.
But
you had to be even at home by like 9-10 sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, there were other campuses where they were like, hey, we're 100% back. And then there were campuses that were like, hey, we're trying to figure out what to do with, our students are only half of them are going to be in the lab at a time. And then the other half, and what am I going to do with the half that are in person? And that's a very different question than we're asking, which is, how am I going to teach an entire lab online? And so, I was able to draw on resources from a lot of people in other parts of the country. And so I don't know if you remember, but there was a lab that you did where there were like videos that had been recorded where you would like watch a lab and then do video, like see a video of something and you had to answer questions about it. All of those videos were recorded by some professor, I want to say Ohio, that had created that lab for her class, and I just wholesale stole it and gave it to your class.
Right.
And then there were other things where I was adapting things where somebody said, hey, this is what I'm doing. And I said, that sounds great. Let me figure out how to adapt that for what I need. And in some cases it was me winging it. In some cases I was able to adapt things that I did in person.
Right.
And so I was able to say, hey, this is a lab that we normally do in person. I can make this an online learning experience. And so just kind of figuring all of that out.
I think another thing that was really good about Beyond Labs, at least for my class, was that we, like you said, we get to experiment a lot with it. Like you said, 30 times, do this reaction, do that, you need a heating mantle, you need to connect it to the little tube over here to let the excess gas get out and not explode, and all those, especially like a lot of safety stuff. So I think in those departments it was designed really well. And when coming back for organic chemistry lab for the second one, for 7B here, organic chemistry 2, everyone already knew what was going on. Like, you didn't really need to tell the students right from the beginning, oh, this is how you set up this apparatus, this is how basically things run in the organic chemistry lab, everyone already had a pretty good idea, even about like basic lab safety stuff, like fume hoods, for example. We already knew how to extract something in the fume hood and like transport it to whatever reaction that we were doing at the time. I've sort of felt confident enough to continue the lab myself without having to really ask really technical questions, at least. And I think you also knew that going into this because you knew the students already had the virtual experience with Beyond Labs.
So I think there's two other aspects of that. The first one is that for that particular year, we ran our 7A lab curriculum as if it was 7B, because the 7A labs are designed to teach you these basic techniques.
Right.
And so we did not feel like we could jump in and say, here's the 7B level labs where we're doing like 6 techniques in one lab that, and so saying like, okay, here's a lab where really we're focused on just setting up a distillation. Whereas like the lab, like, so we're starting 7B right now while we're recording this, and the lab that my students just did 2 days ago, they set up a distillation, they set up an extraction, they did a recrystallization, they, I don't remember what else they did, but they do a reflux. They did a bunch of these different techniques.
All in the same lab.
All in one lab, yeah. And that's a typical 7B lab, is doing a bunch of things, but knowing that you weren't going to be ready for that. And so that was part of it. I think the other part of it is that I just really lucked out in the sense that it turns out that in fall of 2019, I recorded videos. That was my project for that year. And so, talking about projects, my project for 2019 was I decided that I was going to record videos of me doing each lab technique with Moorpark College's equipment.
Right.
So that my students, because if you watch a technique video somewhere else, if you say like, how do I set up a distillation? The glassware is always a little bit different. The equipment's always a little bit different. It doesn't talk about like, so it doesn't quite look the same. And so then when you're, say, reviewing for the lab practical, you don't have that, like, let me see what it looks like at my campus. And so I decided to record all those videos. And, there's like 5 big techniques that we learn in organic chemistry. And so for me to sit down and with my hands record 5 videos using Moorpark College's equipment, Moorpark College's glassware, I just randomly did that as a tool for my current students, having no clue that COVID was coming. And so I just really lucked out that all of a sudden I had those where I could...
What a turn of events.
Exactly. Where then in this pandemic thing, say like, okay, so this is what you're doing on Beyond Labs, but here's a video of what it really looks like. And so you can see here's a real thing. And then all of a sudden the Beyond Labs makes a lot more sense because you've seen a video and then you know what these cartoony looking things in this lab are supposed to be.
Right. Wow. Well, we're coming up on the end of our meeting. I know you said 11:30, so I'm going to ask you one final question.
Sure.
And then close the episode. I really wanted to talk about your research when you did research under the supervision of Sir Fraser, but I think instead of that, I want to ask you a question that's basically a continuation of what we've been discussing about chemistry education in general. And like the first question, I'm hoping that this is going to be a traditional classic question that I will ask in every episode. What are some of your thoughts or final thoughts or words of wisdom that you have for anyone who's out there, might be struggling or may eventually struggle, face the failure that we talked about earlier? What do you tell those people, and how do you hope to inspire them, get them out of that, or like help them get through the challenges of learning a difficult subject, particularly organic chemistry?
Right. So I think in general, the 2 biggest pieces of advice that I can give, and you've probably heard this from many people, is you're not alone and take advantage of your resources. So in other words, like, everybody has struggles, and students so often feel like I'm the only one that's struggling. And it's because when you're around other students, they put on a brave face and they act like they know more than they do, and they're all struggling.
Right.
And so just if you're aware that you're not the only one, all of a sudden everything else becomes much less intimidating. And then taking advantage of resources, particularly office hours and any campus tutoring or anything like that. But, so many people are intimidated by their professor and thinking like, oh, I can't go ask this question because then he's going to know or she's going to know that I'm dumb. And that's the exact opposite is true, because any good professor wants feedback. And so knowing what students are struggling with is really going to help. But also, being able to, answer that question and know that, that they're able to help you. That's what they're there for. And so we love to answer questions. That's where when we know the struggles, and we can often pinpoint exactly what you're stuck on and help you to see the bigger picture or help you to understand how you got stuck. And it's not just here's the answer to your question, but often it's here's the answer to the question and then the next tool that you need so that you don't encounter this sort of problem in the future. With organic chemistry in particular, if we want to get one piece of advice, it's always the piece of advice I say on the very first day of class, which is the way to learn organic chemistry is to study by doing problems. And so you need to be doing problems. Practice. Yes, and daily, regular problem solving. So I always tell my students on the first day, you should be solving problems for 1 hour a week on days of the week that end with Y. So that's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday, Saturday and Sunday. And I say that because then I can keep repeating it, and everybody remembers that. And at first it sounds like a cheesy joke, but it's like something
it's
I can bring up over and over. Exactly. And so when they come back to me and they're like, well, what should I be doing? It's like, well, are you studying on days that end in Y? And usually it's like, well...
Well, not on some
one
days.
Or two, exactly. And so then so pushing yourself to do that. So I think those are kind of the biggest piece of advice.
Wow. You heard it, everyone. You need to be going to office hours, taking advantage of your resources, and also ask questions. There's this Farsi saying in our culture that says there's no shame in asking, there's shame in not knowing. And
that's a good saying.
Yeah, very, very, very good one, actually. I grew up hearing that from my parents all the time. We are done with this episode. Thank you, Dr. Joyner, for joining us today. This was a very enlightening conversation, and everyone here appreciates your presence on this episode, and thank you. And to all of our listeners, once again, please go subscribe to our YouTube channel, Beyond the Box Podcast _, and you can follow our Instagram page at the same address. We are on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and we hope to be on other platforms very soon. Thank you, everyone. We will catch you on the next one.